Hello, we are live. And so here I am to welcome everyone to the Five Tibetans online workshop. I'm Robin Holland, and I work with business owners to help them put new spark in their businesses. And I am your host, along with Susan Westbrook, who is the author of our book, which I love to show and love to read. And this is the book that this whole series is based on. And every time I read it, which is multiple times, I find more goodness in this book. And I'm thrilled to introduce you to our two guests today, Lisa Marie Platske, who is joining us from Washington, D.C., and Yael Melamed, I got it, from San Francisco, California. And today our subject is the fifth Tibetan, the root chakra, miserliness, and connection. Now it's Susan's turn. Go, Susan.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks to everyone who's been a little bit patient with us today. This is a day where we're just going to kind of go with the flow, and as Robin pointed out, we're going to be looking in at the fifth Tibetan, and its element is earth. And so today we're going to be especially focusing on being a little bit more grounded. And one of the behaviors that we're going to talk about today is connection.
So I am going to read some wonderful words I have about our two guests today. Yael Melamed is dedicated to helping people repair their relationships with themselves and others. She holds degrees from Harvard Business School and the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her personal experience of cancer prompted her to re-examine her own life and leave her 10-year business career to pursue her calling as a psychotherapist. She sees individuals, couples, and groups in private practice, and she teaches at the Golden Gate and Pierce Integral Counseling Centers on topics of resentment and forgiveness. Yael loves helping others harness life's challenges in order to grow from them. And Lisa Marie Platske left her action-packed life as a federal law enforcement officer to become the CEO of international leadership training company Upside Thinking Incorporated. An award-winning leadership and connection expert, Lisa Marie takes her law enforcement journey, which began on the piers of New York and ended post 9/11, and shares what exceptional leaders do differently, why connection is the new currency, and how to be positioned to seize lucrative opportunities. Lisa Marie is a certified master coach who has worked with clients from 3 continents and in more than 20 industries on how to be seen, heard, and richly rewarded without compromising who they are. So I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation today with our guests.
I think that's true. I appreciate both of you coming on today. These were speakers from our original series, and 2 very powerful women. And what I most appreciate about both of you is your passion for what you do and your commitment to it and the energy you bring. So I'm really looking forward to us taking away some important information today, but always also being very uplifted by having time with you. So I appreciate both of you being here and sharing the stage, because I know both of you could easily fill an hour by yourselves, and you did before. And so sharing the stage doesn't give you quite as big a platform. So I really encourage those of you who are watching to check them out at their websites, which we had posted in our links this week. And we can also put that up for you again so that you can spend a little bit more time with both of them. So both of you know from past experience, and I'm going to start with my tagline of we tell our stories so other people will tell theirs, and ask you a little bit about how you grew up and how it impacted what you think about being connected in the world today. And so, Yael, I'd like to start with you. And we've heard a little bit about your story from Robin, but if you would just share a little bit with us about what you learned about connection just based on the way you grew up and the people and the activities that you encountered along the way.
Sure. I think I first learned actually about disconnection in the earlier part of my life. I grew up in a very achievement-oriented household and also just social context, and it was all about being strong and self-sufficient and successful. And it's funny, as you were talking, I just got a memory of, I think I was in 6th grade, and this girl named Robin came up to me and she put her arm around me. And then I remember she looked directly in my eyes and I freaked out. And I remember thinking, oh my God, why is she looking at me? Why is she touching me? This is so intense. And I still remember that. It was in the library. And it's something that has stuck with me because I think that level of connection and contact was just so foreign to me. And of course, when that's the way you grow up, you're just not aware of it. It's just the way that it is. And Robin mentioned, when she was introducing me about having cancer, and that was an experience. I was at business school at Harvard, and then suddenly I found out that I had skin cancer. I ended up being totally okay, but it was really a huge gift because it had me really begin to think about my life, and I got very reoriented. And slowly, I'm not going to go into the story now just because of time constraints, but basically I kind of found my way into the world of psychotherapy. And it was such a contrast. This is a culture that did not value all of the things that were valued in my business life of extroversion and quote unquote strength. And here was a world that valued vulnerability and being real and authentic and healing and growing, which means exposing your wounds. And so I definitely had quite an adjustment period at first, and everything that I had been praised and valued for in my prior life, I actually was not appreciated for in this new world. And it was really interesting. People did not appreciate my kind of shtick and my facade, and they really wanted to know me and really see me. And that was terrifying for me. But over time, I really was able to kind of let go of my false self and experience connection. Mm-hmm. And so having had both of those perspectives, I really know the difference between disconnection and miserliness and connection. And I've kind of been on both ends of that polarity. And actually, it's one of the things that I want to do. I see people in private practice, but I also want to go into the business world and kind of bring the world of healing there in order to bridge those and to bring love, connection, and vulnerability into the business world. And that's a movement that I think is already happening. Yes. You can see lots of mindfulness and more personal leadership and coaching happening, and the TED Talks about vulnerability. And it's something that I really want to be part of because I know what it's like and how much suffering there is when you're in disconnection.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that, and for for all of us who maybe grew up not knowing what it was like to be connected, you bring us to a good focal point of what did that teach us, in terms of being disconnected. So sometimes, just like you were talking about, normal was not being connected, right? So how do we as adults come into this and not see our disconnection as just being normal? So if I'm an adult who grew up in a system where I had no connection, how do I even recognize today that I don't have any connection?
Well, it is hard, right, to recognize. It's like, how do you recognize that the air you're breathing is polluted if you've never breathed fresh air? So without the contrast, it is actually hard to recognize. But I think that, maybe one cue is just not feeling good, feeling isolated, feeling lonely, feeling sad. And actually just connecting to yourself, like the meditation that you did is really useful in actually finding out what's inside and monitoring how you feel when you're with other people and what comes up. There was a time where I swore off alcohol for about a year because of some diet that I was on. And not that I was a big drinker before, but I would always have a glass or two of wine when I was meeting with people. And as I stopped having the alcohol, I started to become aware of what was happening inside of me as I would show up at a dinner with someone I didn't know that well and start to notice a lot of anxiety and physical somatic sensations. Wow. And so I had no idea that this made me anxious because I would just have a glass of wine. So things like that, just really paying attention can be good cues.
Okay, well, great. Because I want to ask Lisa Marie, who the last time, I'm going to out you a little bit, Lisa Marie, the last time you were here, you made a pretty big confession that you normally don't talk about your growing up. So I'd like to just hear from you because I think you've sort of been moving into that. I've been watching, because I read your stuff, I get your newsletters, and I've been watching you sort of step into that a little bit. And as you've reflected about your growing up and how that's impacted you, why do you think you have such a connection with connection now based on the way that you were raised and the experiences you had from that time?
Thank you so much, Susan. Thanks for having me here. And yes, you always challenge me to talk about things that are not the typical things for me to speak about. When you ask about connection and growing up, I look at my background in federal law enforcement, those sort of scales of justice where, you have the two sides. And growing up, my life was very much like that. There was a lot of connection from the sense that my mom and her family, there were family gatherings all the time with large groups of people, 50 people, aunts, uncles, cousins, everybody hugged, you sat on people's laps. Everything was just, about that whole element of connection. And my grandfather was someone who was so well respected in the community that regardless of, what we were doing or where we were, I mean, my gosh, just in a short blurb, no Irish in him whatsoever. And yet my grandparents were the king and queen of the St. Patrick's Day parade one year, I mean, stuff like that doesn't happen, but it's just because they're such connectors. And I learned to watch him do that. And then sort of swinging the pendulum, the other end is that I grew up in a single parent household. And while my mother was very loving, she was also very taxed with the responsibilities of being a single mother in a time when, the early 1970s, that was not a cool thing, at all. In fact, as I mentioned, the last time on the call, there were kids in the neighborhood who couldn't play with me because they were afraid divorce was contagious. Their parents, there was such a misunderstanding about what divorce was. And so even in my, Catholic school, I was one kid in the entire school whose parents were divorced. Think about that. I mean, so I was this outsider in many ways. And because the situation was wrapped around domestic violence, where you're talking the absolute opposite of connection, my life had this swinging pendulum to where there were events where everybody was, embracing you and loving you, to, the difficulty of having visitations and the anger and the disconnection from being separated from a parent and really being in an environment that was ugly. And so there was this, swinging back and forth. And something that Yael said that I thought was really interesting is that, when I wrote my book, Connection, the New Currency, the idea of growing up and what I had learned was that I learned that there were winners and losers. There were people who were A students and there were people who were below average students. And you didn't ever want to be, the failure. You always wanted to be the kid that was the winner, right? And so knowledge became power and connection became something that was not as important as being more than. And so, when you look at that, those elements of miserliness versus the opposite of connection, where did that come from? Well, it also came from the rewards that came from being the A student growing up. So I had a lot of these dynamics where it was fantastic with my grandparents. It was, somewhat disastrous with, my parents, yet my mom was an amazing woman who taught me so much about connection. There was the element of sort of the grades and the reward system. I mean, it's just mind-boggling how, we take all of this in and, out comes, the realities of our adult life. And so, I think that as I look at all of those pieces, the biggest lessons learned, and interestingly enough here, that this call is on the week of 9/11 and sort of that whole next step of the journey for me, so much about the push-pull of sinking into miserliness versus understanding that there's great value in connection. And, you asked the question about where it comes from. And I know for me, I had a huge awakening that made me realize that I was not connecting with people. And that was a very, very big moment in time. And prior to that, I don't know that I was very aware. So.
Did you want to share that with us, Lisa Marie?
Sure, of course, why not?
I know.
In law enforcement, and I was used to being the smart one, the one who got the A's and the one who got it right. And so, the peers in New York are a little bit of a different animal, and the guys weren't all that impressed with how smart I was, or how brilliant. And so, I realized that, I needed to do something. And so I had the opportunity to go through a leadership program. And that was my passion. And that was, really what I was very involved with. So I took this, and there were a bunch of assessments. And in one of the assessments, it was a self-assessment. So it was me assessing me. The results came back, and the teacher stood over me and said, so if Lisa Marie invites you to show up at something and you show up, she doesn't really want you to be there.
Well,
and if, you invite her to do something and she comes, know that she's really secretly wishing that she can get away. And I was humiliated. 25 sets of eyes staring at me. I felt, sort of sick to my stomach. I wanted to make myself invisible. I, trapped myself under the desk. And even in sharing this with you now, I can feel that sort of sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. Of when you see how the world potentially sees you or what you're putting out there.
Right.
And I drove home to my really small apartment that day, and I was crying. I was sobbing. Like, is this how people see me? Is this what I'm putting out there? And is it true? All these things that I had learned from my grandfather about connecting, is this really the person that I am? And I spent a lot of time studying connection after that, because I got it. I got why people didn't see me. I got why I was overlooked. I got why connection is so important, especially as an introvert, because sometimes that's my default, is that I need the time to pull back and to be quiet. And so then if people only see, this sort of perfect image, right, and no vulnerability, it becomes inhuman. And so while it was an awful thing, it ended up being one of the best things that ever happened to me. And I really started to study connection. How does it happen? Where does it happen? How do you leverage it? What does it look like? What does it mean? Not building a network. It's not even all necessarily about relationships, but it's certainly a very tangible something. And so in working on that, I was able to repair and strengthen and build incredible relationships in my law enforcement career, where I've been gone, over 10 years, and they still have a sign in the office that said, "What would Lisa do?" Because I was so connected to each person. And it was what really helped me transition into my business with very little effort, because I was humiliated that day, and it was really awful, and I learned a lot. And so, don't we learn a lot from those moments of self-awareness if we choose to put the mirror up and say, how much of this is really, my doing? So.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that, because I'm sure that all of us can relate at some level to someone telling us about ourselves something different than we thought. And it certainly has had a big impact, because you're having a big impact now. And so I'm appreciating that you took it with humility and grace and did look in, because you had options. You could have gone the other way. So thanks for sharing.
I didn't do it all at once. So
it's a process of a process, as Robin says.
Right.
We're all in the process of the process here. So thank you very much. Well, I wanted because Lisa Marie's already started talking about miserliness, I wanted to sort of shift our focus to talking about the grasping behavior today, which is miserliness. And Yael, you work with couples and relationships a lot. I know you work with individuals also, but where does miserliness show up in a couple or in a relationship, and what sort of impact does that end up having?
Yeah, so it is actually very common. I think about miserliness as withholding or withdrawal. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it, Susan?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I see it all the time. I mean, I think that couples and love, it's the process of connection and disconnection and finding connection again and then disconnecting and so on and so forth. And when couples aren't doing well, the periods of disconnection get really huge. And there's a very typical dynamic that I'll see in my office, which is pursuer withdrawer. So there's one member of the couple who is really kind of pursuing contact and the other who's withdrawing. And so, you can see that you can be isolated by just having no relationships, but you can also be in relationship and still be extremely emotionally isolated. And so the work is to heal this withdrawal. And, you were talking earlier, Susan, about how people aren't just born mean and these are protective mechanisms. And that's something that over time I've really seen is the person who is withdrawing isn't necessarily trying to punish the other member of the couple, although in some cases they are, and that can become problematic. But actually, it's a protective mechanism. The person who is withdrawing learned that if they fought, they wouldn't win. And so, we have fight, flight, freeze. And so that person learned that actually flight is the best way to protect yourself. And that pattern that got laid down really early, of course, continues to show up. And so, the idea is to create safety and to really get underneath the withdrawal, to understand what's really happening at a deeper emotional level. This person who's withdrawing actually wants connection. And it seems counterintuitive. It definitely doesn't seem like it to the partner who is pursuing them and they're running away. But that's sort of the work. And so I see it quite a bit.
Yeah, I would okay. So, because the very first time we ever talked, we had a conversation about being in a relationship. And in the book, I talk about being the pursuer or the violencer, the person that, is always going to be verbal or whatever. But I think, when I encounter a partner who I think you used the word stonewalling too, as a word you used in our conversation. It does not feel to me like that person wants to be connected. And so how would I deal with that? I mean, we can't talk about this for an hour, but if you've got a couple of thoughts on that, how do we deal with that when we're with a partner, a friend? It could be friend, it could be business associate, because we're going to hear from Lisa Marie in a second about from more of a business perspective. But how should I react to that when I'm feeling like I've been sort of left standing holding the ball and everyone else has gone home?
Well, first, just to explain the word stonewalling. Stonewalling is really a very extreme form of withdrawal where it's like the person is impenetrable. And there's a couples researcher named John Gottman who predicts the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And he feels that in the first 15 minutes of observing a couple, if one of these horsemen is present, he can predict that they'll be divorced in 5 years. And one of them is stonewalling. So that very, very extreme level of withdrawal predicts divorce. Mm-hmm. But the way, to answer your other question about the way you can deal with it, is to really see the person. So if there's someone screaming at you, to actually see, wait, they're trying to engage with me. I know it might seem violent or mean, but they're engaging with me. They want to connect to me. And then to see the withdrawer and say, this person is just protecting themselves. This person also wants to connect to me. I mean, but the way that they have to protect themselves is through withdrawal. So I think the key is to have maybe a certain kind of view about defenses and to be willing to look underneath the defenses and to understand that all people want love and connection. We're wired that way. We're mammals and we're wired for connection. And so whatever behaviors seem opposite to that are just defenses, and to really try to see the person underneath the defense and to have empathy for and compassion for the fact that they need to protect themselves. Mm-hmm. And I find that love begets love and vulnerability begets vulnerability. So if you give that, you'll probably start to see those defenses melt and lower.
Thank you. Well, Lisa Marie, so, how does that relate to what you see in business settings? Or, so, because this is a great comparison for us today. We couldn't have planned this any better, right? From our relational sort of therapeutic to you working with leadership and business. Where do you see miserliness and that sort of disconnect show up in business settings, and what kind of impact does that have?
Well, I really love the fact that Yael shared that research, I will say, because I think that research applies across the board, even though it was done for couples, that you can really predict these behaviors based on someone's conversation and the things that they're doing, as far as withholding information or withholding something of value. And I think how I've seen it show up is that it's interesting. You hear people talk about give and take relationships in business. So you have a connection with someone in business, and the expectation is that most people have been told or have taken a course where you're supposed to give first, right? And giver's gain, is also one of the business sayings, and yet at the same time, what's interesting is that depending on what's going on in somebody's life, whether or not they truly understand the generator of giving and receiving, and that giving and receiving doesn't have to come from the same person or the same opportunity or the same place, that you can actually physically watch people almost label someone like, this person hasn't bought from me, so therefore I'll only share so much with them. Mm-hmm. Or this person hasn't done anything for me, so therefore I'm really cautious. And mm-hmm. So sometimes, I'll have connection calls with people. I really want to get to know somebody. And it's interesting to watch the defenses of, is this someone who might sell something to me? Is this someone who, may actually be, in the space of wanting to get something from me? And so there's this push-pull element versus a person who really gets connection. And that connection is the opportunity, and giving and receiving is a natural way. And so, even if you never, and because it doesn't come from the same place, even if you never do business with someone, the reality is it may come from some place, and it's your behavior in the giving and receiving and how it translates to every other relationship in your life. So I find that, when we talk about, this idea of connection as an intentional action, it really is about understanding that generator of giving and receiving, and that giver's gain is a great, is a clever way of talking about it, but having the expectation to receive something and also giving something and recognizing that they have nothing to do with one person, they have to do with your total presence and who you are is really what keeps that generator going and moving and allowing opportunities to flow to you rather than away from you. And so I see that all the time, almost like there's this block, like people are protecting themselves from being sold to, or God forbid, somebody, why do you want to connect with me? Like, what does that mean? Almost this fear of what might happen. So,
no, I'm sitting here thinking about just that notion that we sometimes withhold because we don't think the other person's going to give us anything. And so it's sort of like, that's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? It's like, so they're not going to give me anything, so I'm going to withhold, so I'm not going to get anything. I mean, that's like, so I love that. I had never thought of it from that perspective. So in a business culture, then let's just, because you work with some fairly high level business executives, what's like, just name me one thing that you see happen in a business culture that really sort of epitomizes this notion of withholding on the basis of, I'm not sure I'm going to receive something, or you're not going to be able to give me much, or how would that show up?
Oh, I think it shows up when, one example and would have to do with, business owners who go to networking events. And then they come back and say, nothing happened. I knew nothing was going to happen because, and what's fascinating about that is they're not going into the event or circumstance or whatever with the expectation of connecting. They're going in with the expectation of selling or somebody doing something for them, right? So it isn't about the relationship, and it isn't about, showing up and being the best version and being of service and having the expectation that something will come back at some point in time. It's about going and getting something. And that's where I think, that's one example. I mean, I could give you many examples, but that's one really common one with people in business, or even to some degree, some executives that are involved in community events. So.
Yeah. Well, I can see that also because whether you're a coach or a therapist, you have people who come for free consults, or, you go out and you give a free talk, or you do something. And if you carry that sort of notion of, I'm not going to get anything, or I'm only going to give as much as I think I'm going to get back, then we're not, you've already stated it, we're definitely not in service there. And probably what we would have contributed is diluted or diffused out of just our sense of expectation for something coming back to us. So I like that. It's very practical and something I can take away and work with myself, because as you were talking, I was thinking, I think I do that sometimes. So I got to go home and look at the mirror and see. So Yael has to leave us in a couple of minutes. So I want to make sure that we get to our last question with her, and that is basically we've talked a little bit about miserliness. You guys have been really forthcoming about your past and how that disconnection has led you to be such advocates for connection. But Yael, what are 2 or 3 or 4 keys to connection for people in terms of our relationships and our partnering in the world, our more intimate world? What do you think are some keys there for our connection?
There are, but if it's okay, I wanted to just support what Lisa Marie was saying from the psychology perspective. Is that okay?
I think she'll be happy if you support her.
I just wanted to say that, there's one thing is the conscious conversation that we're having and the conscious interaction that we're having, but people's unconscious minds are also interacting. And so my unconscious is reading your unconscious. It's also reading your conscious. And there's a whole matrix of the communications. And so part of what you're saying is that when you're kind of holding that, people react to it. And some of it is what you're bringing consciously, but also I just wanted to remind people that, people can feel what's happening on an unconscious level as well. And I just think that that's part of the equation that you're talking about.
So if you're looking at me and I'm thinking, and you're talking to me and I'm thinking you only care about me if I'm going to buy your product, then I'm not there anyway. I've already gone away.
And I can feel that even if your mouth and your words are saying something else. And to your point, yeah.
Right.
So yeah, just wanted to add that. But to answer your question about connection, so, both personally and through my work, it's something I've really taken a deep dive into. And it's not easy. It's really hard and it's really challenging, especially if you have erected defenses to protect you for various reasons. And so the few things I would say are crucial. The first is being in contact with yourself. And we talked about that earlier. But the trick to connection is if you're just there, then where is the other person? So then you also need to be aware of what's happening with the other person, sensing that person, listening to that person, feeling that person. And then there's the dance. It's like, how can I be in contact with myself while being in contact with the other? Because you'll see a lot of people who are just in contact with themselves and can appear rather self-absorbed, or people who totally abandon themselves and are completely focused on the other. And neither of those is true connection. And so it's really a dance to find a way to be in contact with yourself while being in contact with another person. I'd say the second element is really vulnerability. And I think we've kind of really touched on that today. And that's a big theme. And Brene Brown has this great TED Talk that kind of spread. And I think it's really worth watching. But being vulnerable is really important in connection, because if you're trying to be strong or amazing or great and you have this facade, it's like people can't really feel you. People want to feel your heart. I think the world is really changing and consciousness is really changing. And there's actually a lot more room and space for us to be able to do that. When I've gone to business meetings more recently, I'm amazed by how different it is than, say, 1999 when I started my business career and what's allowed by way of being human and being vulnerable. And so I think that that's great that the world is supporting this movement towards vulnerability and thereby towards connection. I'd say, another thing about connection is being messy. Actually, because when you try to be too perfect, you're holding yourself back. It's sort of like, sure, you're not messing up, but you're also not being fully you. So I think that to really be in connection, it's important to leave the space to be messy, to be imperfect, to be you. And then to work with whatever comes up. Because again, if you're too perfect, it's like, who are you? I really can't feel you. There are probably two more things.
So sort of you incorporated our healing behaviors in there. We've got vulnerability and authenticity, I would say, are two keys to actually standing and being in that connection. I know you're gonna have to leave us, but if there was just one thing about connection that you thought, you'd be disappointed if we didn't get from this conversation, what would you want to leave us with in terms of what's my most important take-home message as a person in an intimate relationship, whether that's a friend or a lover, either one? What do I need to know?
So the takeaways, well, I guess I wanted to remind people about touch and eye contact. Again, it's something in an Anglo culture that we might not have as much of. And, if someone's really upset, just putting your hand on them can make a huge difference to settle their nervous system and help them connect. So that would be one thing. And another thing is just being real. I think so many times people try to be nervous and not talk about it. But I found that if you're nervous and you name it and you say, I'm feeling a little bit nervous, it's actually very connecting. So I think the trick is that what we think might be imperfections and we have to hide actually can be very connective if we talk about it. So I would just say to be real and to talk about it and to share it.
Do you have one more thing that you want to share with us?
To share just actually the amazing freeing secret is that you can just be you. And that's the best way to connect, to just be you. And for me, when I realized that, it was so relieving. It's a lot less work.
That is the most beautiful summation that you could have left us with. So thank you. And thanks for being with us today. It was great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.